you for joining me. I'm so honored, so very, very honored. We are into Genesis chapter 14. So we're pedaling right along. But there's more than 50 chapters in this book. And so we're going to be here a while. But we've gotten up to Abraham. And if you've been following along in the timeline, Abraham is a very, very significant character in the book of Genesis. And as we enter into Abraham, we see a lot of things that are going to play into the story right up to the cross and beyond. And so we're into a very, very important time period as far as history is concerned. Again, thank you for joining me. In Genesis chapter 14, we are going to discover these 10 things, God willing. And if I don't reveal them to you during the course of this class, then just look them up on your own. And so I think that you'll, Cindy and I put these questions together yesterday as we are driving along, as a matter of fact. And got these all together so that you'd have them for school biblical studies and others who are just doing them on your own, etc. So there you go. Take a picture of that. Here we go on our study of Genesis chapter 14. Remember, as we review creation, chapter 1. Chapter 2, take two of those creations, put them together, because chapter 2 is basically a retelling of chapter 1, except we're emphasizing the creation of man and woman. Chapter 3, we've got the fall of man, thus the serpent. 4, Cain kills Abel. 5, we begin the story of Noah. And we're going to start it off by giving kind of a lineage outline of his people. And we're going to go all the way back to Adam. So that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then you come over here and you got the big boat. So we start off with this lead up, almost a summary of the background of Noah. Then in chapter 6, we get the word bubble from heaven, time to build the big boat. And so Noah is given that command. In chapter, that was 6. I said, chapter 6. Chapter 7, we're going to have the flood's going to come on the earth. And chapter 8, send out a raven. Then we're going to send out a dove. Remember all of that, telling them they can get off the boat. Chapter 9, we're going to have the covenant with Noah and the rest of the world, thus the rainbow. Chapter 10, I thought that was a really good clue, as where it's supposed to be a map, and here's a pin in the map, etc. But in chapter 10, Noah's descendants are going to disperse, and they're going to go out, as is commanded by God, by the way. But in chapter 11, that dispersion is going to hit a speed bump. And what's going to happen is they're going to all gather in one area, and they're going to build the Tower of Babel and try to make a name for themselves. And they were living in rebellion towards the plan of God, which, by the way, I think continues to exist even today. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife," etc. I think that God intends for us to disperse. He intends for us to span out. And I'm not sure families living on top of each other is a very good idea. But the Tower of Babel here, in chapter 11, chapter 12, we have got Abram, who eventually is going to be called Abraham. Abram is going to be called to the land of Canaan, and he's going to begin that journey. Okay, so you got that little spot on the map. You see how Gabriel did that? I thought that was pretty good. All right, and then chapter 13, excuse me, still dealing with that head cold. In chapter 13, Abram and Lot, they kind of get their heads together, and Abram says, "Hey, listen, our folks are fighting because there's just not enough land to support both of us. They're pretty wealthy folks at this point, and so they're going to separate and go their different ways." And Lot is going to make that very selfish choice of the best land down in the valley. And so many applications. Just because it looks good to the physical eye doesn't necessarily mean that it's really good to partake in, And next thing you know, Lot is pitching his tent towards Sodom. We're going to find he's going to be moving into Sodom. He's going to lose his entire family because he was too concerned about socialization and not nearly enough concerned with just staying with God. And Abraham had protected him, it seems, up to this particular point. But Abraham is going to take the mountainous country and really is going to be given all of Canaan. But he's going to move to other parts. And some exciting stuff is going to happen in chapter 14. Abram doesn't just turn his back on Lot, just because Lot turns his back, it seems, on the values of God. And he pitches his tents towards Sodom, ends up being there. In chapter 14, we're going to find out that Lot's actually going to be taken captive. And Uncle Abram is going to come to the rescue. Really exciting chapter. Hi, Mom. Hi, Debbie. Thank you. Happy Lord's Day to y'all. So Abram is going to rescue Lot, and he's going to meet Melchizedek, a very mysterious character in the Old Testament. Here is your memory verse. Going to have to do a lot of drinking water today, guys, because this head cold really bothered me. I realize it's a little bit lengthy, but it's a very, very important verse, or verses. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest to God Most High. Very important. We're going to find that Melchizedek's not just a king, he's also a priest. That's an interesting combination. Can you think of anybody else who's a king and a priest? A high priest, for that matter. Jesus, exactly. And he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And here we begin this idea of giving a tenth. And that will be carried on over into the new law, into the old law, which would be the new law because it hadn't come about yet. But you get the point. So that's the story or the memory verse. Here is the actual text. Now, this is one of those texts, again, where you're going to make fun of old Sonny Childs for his reading ability. But listen, you try to read these names and tell me if you can do any better. In fact, I showed Cindy my screen. It doesn't show this to you this way, but my screen, it does that, what do you call it, text editing and all that kind of thing. Well, I'm telling you, there's probably 15 different red lines underneath these because it doesn't recognize them as words. Okay, so here we go. You ready? At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim. That's a good name. I like that. Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is in the Dead Sea Valley. That's interesting, the Dead Sea Valley. A lot of people believe that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were located there in the Dead Sea Basin. And that would make a lot of sense, not just because we've got this text that points to that, but when you begin to realize that this area was cursed by God, literally. I've been there. And I mean, it's just, there's nothing there. It's just desolate area. It's almost like God put his thumbprint there and he said, because of the perversion of these people, homosexuality most certainly was part of those perversions. There were others, but that was certainly part of it. But he said, because of that, I am. And so it ought to give us pause with regards to how much our nation is embracing homosexuality. But back to the text. In that basin, that area, it indicated earlier that you might recall that Lot is going to choose to take that land. Why? Because it's well watered and it's got, and everything's green. This would be a good place for me to take my flocks and herds and all that kind of thing, right? Well, it ain't no more. Forgive my English, but it ain't no more. And again, being there, looking upon it myself, it's nothing but brown. Okay. It just shows you how God can take a spot that was once fertile and he can wipe it out as far as the fertility is concerned, especially when mankind is not what mankind needs to be. Hi, Greg, up there in Maryland. Love you guys. Thanks for joining. So we're going to see that they're going to go to war, and that's in the Dead Sea area that they're going to do. I should have had a map up here that I show you where those things are. But if you can picture Jerusalem, go south, and south from Jerusalem. Now let's do it a different way. Picture the Sea of Galilee at the top. Okay, what connects the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea? Jordan River. So got Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. Okay, go right to the top of the Dead Sea and in just slightly to the west, and you're going to get Jerusalem. Okay, but the Dead Sea area, very prominent in Scripture. Now, verse 4, I think this comes up in your question period. For 12 years, they had been subject to Kedorlaomer. But in the 13th year, they rebelled. So they're tired of this Kedorlaomer fella, and they have been paying taxes and letting him reign and rule and all that kind of stuff. So they're tired of it. And so they're going to rebel. They're going to try to get out from underneath this Kedorlaomer guy. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and they defeated the Rephites and the Ashtoreth, Karnaim. Let me do that. They defeated the Rephites in Ashtoreth, Karnaim. The Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Shabba Kirathaim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir as far as El Paranir, the desert. How am I doing those things? Hang with me. We got more to come. All right. Then they turned back and went to En Mishpat. That is Kadesh. And we've heard of Kadesh. And they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites, who were living in Hazon Tamar. All right, so we got kind of the history here, okay? We got this Kedorlaomer fella, and they're not happy with him, and so some folks are rebelling. And what we basically have is this is just a big time of war. And so they're going to go out and they're going to fight with each other and show their manhood and see who can whoop up on who and all that kind of thing. Well, in the process, Lot's going to get taken captive. We're about to see that as we change the channel. But I just wanted you guys to make sure you acknowledge how much Sonny Childs did there with all of these crazy names. I had to get extra points today. All right, moving on then in verse 8. Now, this is not the end of our chapter, okay, guys? So don't get worried here. But I want to make sure I break it up into subject matters. All right, more reading. Then the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah and the king of Zeboiim, love that name, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam. So there's that bad guy. Nobody likes him. Tidal, I'm not sure he got much respect back in the day. What a name. Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. That's another one of your questions, I believe. 4 kings going up against 5. So we got, the odds are not as even as perhaps we'd like for them to be. Now, the Valley of Siddim, this is kind of interesting. It's the only reference we got, but it's really kind of cool. Now, the Valley of Siddim was full of tar pits. That's interesting, isn't it? It's full of tar pits. And when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them and the rest fled to the hills. I shouldn't be laughing. They fell into the tar pit. That can't be good. But anyhow, I can't say it funny, but I saw a meme some months ago, and it said something about how that I really expected by this time in my life that I'd be more at risk at falling into quicksand. It was something of that nature. But do you remember as a child back in the day, those of us are old, do you remember back in the day, it seemed like every cowboy series or whatever, it always had quicksand. That was the big one. You're going to get sucked under in the quicksand. Well, in this story, it's not quicksand, it's tar pits. And you got these kings, and they're out there fighting and everything, and a bunch of guys are evidently going to fall in the tar pit. Now, I don't know what happens when you fall into a tar pit, but it doesn't sound like it'd be a good way to go. I mean, I've seen tar. I put tar on roofs and all that, and it's sticky and gooey and gets all over everything, but generally tar is hot. And I suspect that's the case. And so it kind of mix up the whole idea of quicksand and tar pits, and you got a pretty horrible ending here. But we got guys, I guess they're rushing through there. They're doing a sword thing. Maybe they're on a horse, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, boom, and they're in the tar. And then they're going down, and it's not good. All right, so they fell in the tar pit. I probably made too much of that, but I just found that to be rather interesting in a sick kind of way. All right, so they fell, and the rest of them fled to the hills. Let's get out of the valley here with all this tar pit stuff, and let's get to the hills, they said. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the food, and then they went away. So they're going to go into Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're going to just take over the place, okay? And they just, they're going to carry people off too. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions since he was living in Sodom. Now notice here the next reference we got him living in Sodom, okay? Last time we heard of Lot, he was looking at how good the valley looks, and he was pitching his tent towards Sodom. He was on his way that direction. Remember, this is a nomad. This is a guy who grew up just running from place to place and taking his herds here, there, and yonder. He doesn't settle down. But this is a country boy who gets the bright lights of the big city in his head, and he just has to go there, okay? And we're going to find eventually he's sitting in the city gates. He's going to be one of the rulers, the council there, etc. It's just a really remarkable story of somebody who left their roots. They left their values in God because they wanted social interaction for themselves and their family. And he's going to lose his daughter, he's going to lose his wife over this because of the horrible, poor decisions that he made here. But anyhow, this is the point of the story. They carried off Abram's nephew Lot. Now, that's not a good idea because Lot's not, somebody to snicker at. Lot's got power. Abraham, forgive me. Abraham's not somebody that you just kind of, turn your back and walk away from. Abram's got a lot of stuff. He's got a lot of power. Now, clearly Lot does too. We're going to see here in just a moment. Abram's got basically a trained army that grew up in his house. And so he's going to take that army and he's going to go rescue Lot. Now, there's no indication that Lot learns his lesson. You'd have thought by this particular point, he would have really had a lot of honor for Abram and all that kind of thing. But Lot's going to turn right back around and go back in and live in the city, and that's when he loses his family, etc. Okay? All right, now this gets into the interesting stuff. A man who had, not that the rest wasn't interesting, it just was hard to read. A man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. So somebody escapes from the battle. They didn't fall in the tar pit, evidently. And they run up to Abram and they say, hey, Abram, guess what? Your nephew Lot, he's been taken captive. Well, Abram's not going to sit still for that. Now, Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre, the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol, and Anar, all of whom are allied with Abram. So Abram gets this message, and he's living up there by the big trees, and he gets this message, and he's got some friends. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318, I think that's one of your questions, the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, I don't know that necessarily means that's the only number, because he's got these other allies up here. But the small army that Abram himself is going to command, 318 men, and the thing that's interesting is they all were born in his household. Now, what does that indicate? What does that mean? Let me take you to another story of Abram, who's at this point going to be Abraham and Sarah. But you might recall that God is going to promise that they will have a child late in life. And Sarah laughs. Well, when that doesn't happen as quickly as they felt like it should, you might recall that Sarah is going to give Hagar, her handmaiden, to Abraham. He'll sleep with her. She gets pregnant. They have a son, but it's not the son of promise. The son that they have, Ishmael, is actually a son that was born by human wisdom and human impatience, etc. Side note, the Islamic people, the Muslims, they trace their lineage back to Ishmael. They thought that if they did that somehow that would help endear them to other Bible people. It don't. If you study Ishmael, you know that he's a wild donkey of a man. That's the words of the Bible, not Sonny Chalice. And he's always constantly fighting with his brothers, that kind of a thing. And they claim to trace their lineage back to him. I don't believe they can. But they claim to trace their lineage back to him. And so Muhammad took great pride in the fact that he was a descendant of Ishmael. The problem was, I'm convinced Muhammad couldn't read. And I'm confident that that's the case. And because of that, he wasn't very well educated in what the Bible actually said about some things. If you read the Quran, which I have, he messes up all kinds of scriptures within the Quran. But that's a whole other subject. But in that story, which this part is true, forget Muhammad, this part is true. Hagar does have a son. His name is Ishmael. And by the way, he does belong to Abraham. And so my point for telling you that is, this shows you how that, they're not only back in the day did men have multiple wives, but even the other women who were living there under his supervision, and they could be married. They often were married, that servant women and that kind of thing. And back in the day, the servants of that day were not necessarily the same as the slaves of basically modern history in America. Some of them were, but there's a little bit of a difference. You're going to have to study that in history. But it was almost, back in the day, it was almost like an employer-employee situation. A little more intense than that. But anyhow, my point is that Abraham was basically in charge of this entire group of folks, multiple families. And they had herds and they had all of this kind of thing. And there was an authority system that happened in the family, but it all came back to Abram. He was basically the king over this moving generation of people. And so when it says here that they were born in his household, it's no doubt talking about a lot of folks who were not necessarily directly biologically connected to Abraham, but they were directly connected to Abram in the sense that Abram was in charge of them. He's the king, in the sense, of this group of people. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. We've heard of that city. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions together with the women and the other people. Now, excuse me, again, we don't get a lot of, for you and I making a movie in our head, we wanted to have the battle scene, but we don't get any of that. Except this idea he's going to divide his men and he's going to rout them, which, I'd like to know a little more details. But anyhow, the point is not that. The point is that Abraham did the job through the blessing of God. So he's going to rescue Lot, going to take back all the possessions, and he's going to get all the women and the other people, and they're going to get to go home. And so everybody likes Abram at this particular point, as you can imagine. Verse 17, after Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him. Now we're going to see another king here in a moment, but remember, this is the king of Sodom. So he's not a good guy as far as I can tell. And we know from earlier in the text that they were a wicked city. And so I assume that he's a wicked man. So the king of Sodom is going to come out to meet Abram in the valley of Sheba. Shaba? I don't know. That is the King's Valley, kind of a cool name. So they're going to go out, they're going to meet in the King's Valley. And he's going to be thankful. At that same time, evidently, Melchizedek, king of Salem, is going to bring out bread and wine. Now, Melchizedek is the priest of the Most High God. I want to back up here just a second. Now, don't get these two guys mixed up, okay? We got the king of Sodom, and we got the king of Salem. Most folks believe that's Jerusalem. Back before it's Jerusalem, it's the king of Salem, okay? So, for just a moment, we've got this, what do you call it? We got this inset of a thought. We've been dealing with the king of Sodom, but for just a second, let's talk about Melchizedek, and then we'll come back to Melchizedek. But anyhow, all right, so king of Sodom, then Melchizedek steps up. He's going to bring bread and wine. Now, Melchizedek is going to be identified as the priest of God Most High. The reason that's interesting is because you might recall that we don't have priests yet, as far as the Levitical code is concerned, as far as the old law is concerned. He was a priest before there were priests, I guess you could say. Oh, forgive me, guys. I've got to blow my nose. And I know this is terribly unprofessional, so I'm going outside to do it. Stay there. Don't go anybody. Go away. Oh, my. When you do Bible class with Sonny Charles, it gets plumb weird. I'm sorry, but I just couldn't talk. All right, so back to our story. So first we got the king of Sodom. Now, for a moment, let's talk about the king of Salem, not the same cities, okay? King of Salem is a mysterious guy. This Melchizedek, who comes up like, I think, 5 times, something like that in the Bible. But this Melchizedek guy, he is going to bring out bread and wine. And this guy is going to be a king, and he's going to be a priest, and he's going to be a priest of God. So this is not, not a false priest or anything of that nature. And he is going to pronounce a blessing on Abram. And he says, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and the earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. That, of course, is our memory verse for today. Oh, I got to run. Okay, so you got the memory verse happening. Too much blowing your nose. So you got to get after this thing. So you got Abram giving 1/10 of everything. That kind of sets the stage for this whole idea of tithing, okay? Then the king of Sodom, now we're reverting back to the other guy. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. I'm really thankful that you went on this trip and you did this for me. So you just, if you will, return to me the population and you keep all the goods. But Abram said, not happening. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, with raised hand, I have sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. Now, why does he do that? I can't prove this, but I think because he sees something that Lot's not paying attention to. Lot's moving into town. Abram said, not me. I'm not going to be beholden to you folks. You're wicked, evil people. That's how I see this happening. Although he doesn't say that specifically. I think that's what's taking place here. And it's almost like he's saying, that's dirty money. I'm not doing that. I don't want you to ever be able to hold over my head that I you can say that, oh, we're the ones who made Abraham rich. I don't want you guys to have that kind of a leverage over top of me. Massive applications for families today. Those individuals out there in the world, secular world, who are holding leverage over you, keeping you in worldly situation, you need to break those ties. All right, so verse 24. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me. So the other guys can make up their own mind, I guess, is what he's saying. But I'm not taking anything. To Anar, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them have their share. They went and helped. So if they want, that's their choice. But I'm not going to do anything that's going to keep your hand over top of me. All right. So interesting passage here. We'll learn more about Melchizedek later. But interesting passage here with regards to Melchizedek, the king of Sodom, Lot, his priorities, Abraham sensing, I think, that he doesn't need to be, forgive the terminology, but he doesn't need to be in bed with the people of Sodom. And so he's not going to, see what I'm saying? All right, here are your questions that we tried to cover. I want to make a point here. I'm pretty sure I did something really bad. I'm pretty sure, let me come back. I'm pretty sure this text is NIV. I'm just now noticing that. And then one of the things that showed that to me was, did you notice the name Kedorlaomer? I don't see it here. Baloney breath. I thought I saw that. Let's go back one more here. I'm pretty sure here. Kedorlaomer. You see that spelling? I'm pretty sure this is NIV. The ESV, what happens is the best translation is multiple translations. And what happens is I flop back and forth, and I try to stay within one. And the text is supposed to come from the ESV, but I blew it. Okay, this is the NIV, I'm pretty sure. And then notice the spelling here. I'll watch it here in a second in the questions. Notice the spelling here. That's the same guy. Okay, it's just got a CH instead of a K. And I ask you to forgive me. I had all this stuff in my head, and I can't think straight. There you go. Okay. Hi, Rajesh. Good to see you over there in India land. I appreciate you for being with us. Here is your do the doodle moment, chapter 14. I thought Gabriel did a pretty good job here. Sword, have to go rescue Lot. Crown, what's that tell you? Kings, but also it should bring up this idea of Melchizedek. Good job, Gabriel. All right, time to pray. We got about 3 minutes here. If you got a prayer request, put it up there on the screen. And we can deal with it even beyond while I'm going into my sermon time if you have a comment that you want to make. But please continue to be mindful of folks. Some folks in the Deep South were ravaged by tornadoes. We've got a lot of flooding, I'm told, in Tennessee. And so a lot of weather conditions that are happening on this side of the big gulp. Rajesh, you got anything over there in India that we need to be praying about for you folks? So please remember all that's going on here in our nation, as well as other nations, such as where Rajesh lives. I wanted to bring you to this slide. I hope you can see it. You've seen these before. These are the real-time classes that are about to start. Actually, by way of announcement, there'll be no class tonight. I actually will go live with something else, so go ahead and join me. But there'll be no class tonight in the book of Revelation. Or Monday night, I'll go live then too, so join me, but not in the typical sense. Or Wednesday night, because we're in what I'm calling spring quarter break. So we're at the end of the first quarter. Many of you have already done your last lessons, and thank you. You can be expecting your certificate of completion to be coming in the mail, etc. And for those of you who completed your work, I believe I also promised you a mug. Contributors giving us enough money so you got a free mug with the logo on it. So that's pretty cool. You're doing well, my friend. Need some Cindy tea, and I don't know about the hot toddy, Greg, but I need something because I got all this stuff. So you can pray for me. That'd be great. But anyhow, starting the 4th, which is a week from today, we will begin looking again. We'll continue into the book of Genesis, so chapter 15. And we're going to start a series on the blessed assurance. Really hope that you'll be a part of that. Revelation will continue. Helping the homosexual on Monday nights. Romans, going to be a challenging study on Wednesdays at 5. And then flipping tables will be the reading assignment. The reason I want you to see this, I want you to be praying about this, because we're adding a second tier to our classes. And this is personal pace classes. These are classes that you can take at your personal pace. And they'll be sent to you. These are 2 reading assignments. These are video lessons. I'll send you a link if you desire it, and you can just go through. And what'll happen in this one, you'll just have all the links. And as you work through it slowly, and you can turn in the questions to us at your own pace, and we can look at them, peruse them, and comment and whatever. So be praying, if you will. Cindy, my little wife, has been working so hard. She's been taking care of me and getting this SBS. She's an amazing woman. As I tell my buddy Greg up there in Maryland all the time, we married up, son. You know what I'm saying? Grace, she's an amazing woman too. All right. Lord's Day Live. That's where we are, and it's almost time, isn't it? Get that lubrication taking place. The Christian resistance. This is our last lesson, and it will be a review. And so sometimes I say that, and I'm worried people are going to, I'm not going to listen to it because we've already been through all this. But one of the beauties of the review, I think, is the review kind of puts it all back together, because we've stretched this thing out over 12 weeks now. And now all that, and so it's going to be rapid. But I think you're going to be able to see the mentality of what I've tried to put together over the last 12 weeks. And hopefully it'll be a blessing to you. Principles for governing civil disobedience. There are the 5 questions for the School of Biblical Studies, folks, that you can have and try to complete as I go through this material. I want to remind you that, now again, this is all review, but I want to remind you that we had 2 parts to our 12-week quarter. And they wrap themselves around these 2 areas. The primary amount of material came from the first one, that is the revival of the Christian resistance. And how do we promote that? Fan the flames, if you will, of Christians who need to grow a backbone and stand up and be what they need to be. And so we took you to a bunch of New Testament examples. The second part is survival of the underground church. We'll deal with that in just a moment. By way of introduction, though, you might recall that I took you to a little bit of a history lesson with regards to the times of Jesus and what they look like, politically speaking. And you might recall there are actually 3 tiers of politics back in the day. Very complicated time. Those individuals who would claim that Jesus never really got himself involved in politics, they don't really understand history. They don't appreciate the times in which Jesus lived. Almost everything Jesus said publicly touched some level of politics. Now, I'm not suggesting that Jesus himself ran for office, and I'm not suggesting that politics was a primary reason for his comments, but it is very naive to suggest that Jesus did not engage politics. And one of the reasons is because here's the complicated political system of his day. The most common the level with which he had most interaction would be called a theocracy. That's we would call that kind of the local government, and then the state and the national. The theocracy, that was folks like the Sanhedrin and the scribes and Pharisees, those folks that were constantly pestering Jesus, but they believed that they had authority because it was divinely given. And so because of God's edict that you guys can reign, Jesus would call it sitting in the seat of Moses, then they would reign. And sometimes they were more fearsome than the other 2 levels. But anyhow, that's the theocracy. Then there was another level, and this is kind of a leftover from a different time, okay? But there's the tetrarchy is going to be essentially Herod. I don't want to go back and review too much, but state, it's kind of like the state. It was kind of the local government, but not the city government as much as the local government over a particular region. And that's going to be Herod. And then imperialism, of course, that's going to be Rome. All I want you to see is, as we were by way of review, was remember that Jesus lives in a very, very, very complicated political system. And therefore, everything he did had political ramifications. Everything he said had political ramifications. And so the whole concept of Christian resistance or civil disobedience was very familiar to Jesus. Okay? As we looked at this first part, the New Testament examples, I gave you 3 principles. And these principles were rooted in the story of Jesus when he cleansed the temple. Remember that? Here's actually the story itself. John chapter 2. And you might recall that he goes down there to the temple. He stands there long enough to make a whip. That's where we got our first one. And that is that Jesus, when considering civil disobedience, he actually took time to consider it. He didn't just leap in there. He wasn't just, a zealot in the sense that they just were hacking and slashing at anything they didn't like. He wasn't like this new woke generation that we seem to have, the cancel culture that just, toppling statues. And he didn't just go about randomly, making trouble. He took time to consider before confronting. Now, he did confront. That's the thing that bugs me about these weak-kneed preachers is they this idea because Jesus takes time to consider that he evidently didn't confront. Now, you haven't read your book. Jesus was in confrontation all the time. But the first point was he got to think. He got to stop and think before he confronts. This is the violent area. That's why it's in red. And then verse 16, and he told those who sold pigeons, take these things away. Do not make my father's house a house of trade. That's where we got our second point, this idea of preservation, not retaliation. There was a purpose. He wasn't just hacking away for no reason. The purpose was they had destroyed the holiness of the temple. And so he's preserving the holiness of the temple. He's not just retaliating and going out, punching people for no reason. And then verse 17, his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. If you go to the Mark account, it says this, and the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him because all the crowd was astonished at his teachings. The only point that I was trying to make when you put these two passages together is that evidently there was a great deal of evangelistic purpose to his cleansing the temple. And so when Jesus went about considering civil disobedience, he ran it through at least these three areas. He took time to consider. He asked himself, why in the world am I doing this? Is it worth it? And number three, he said, how am I going to lead people to Christ through this? I think this is one of the most powerful points because unlike, again, the preachers, we got so many of them in the pulpit nowadays with jelly for backbones, won't confront, politics or whatever it may be. I find it interesting that Jesus actually used confrontation to evangelize. He actually gave us an example of how standing toe-to-toe with somebody and being confrontational, even in a debate mode, can lead people to Christ. We need more preachers who got some of that. Then we entered into the second part, and that is this idea of survival. How do we revive the New Testament examples? Okay. And then this underground church. What do we got to do to build the underground church? And you might recall this picture with the tank rolling up, which I think could come at any day in our nation, given the horrible perversion that we're seeing around about us. God's plan for survival for the underground church. I suggested to you that there are three building blocks. We've got to return to the family and fellowship and friends, and they all build upon one another, which the next slide should show us. All right. So as we build the underground church, we recognize these three tiers, again, taken from a passage of scripture, not Sonny Childs' brain. Acts chapter 2, they were together all the time. That's fellowship. They did their togetherness in the home. That's family. And the Lord adds to their number. That's friends. And so these are the three layers, tiers, if you will, of building a home church, building the underground church so that it will survive. You might recall that we as we broke those down, and I just rapidly give you these in review. The family, the first tier. Acts chapter 2, they've broken the bread in their homes. That's where we took this idea. You might recall in Titus chapter 2 that the older women are commanded to teach the younger women to establish homes. You know why? Because family is the bedrock foundation of a culture. More importantly, it's the bedrock foundation of the church. And then you see that, of course, playing out over here in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where one of the qualifications of an elder is, I did that again. This is one of the qualifications of a widow being taken into the number. Timothy is also going to say in chapter 3 that it's also a qualification of an elder to be hospitable. But in this particular case, a widow, and before she is to be taken into the number, she is to be judged as to whether or not she's worthy. And there are several things that will make her worthy is whether or not she has shown hospitality. She is faithful to her husband, etc., raised children. Okay, so you see, family was huge to the early church, and we need to return there if we're going to see our nation reclaimed. Had a sweet elderly lady who asked me just recently online. She said, "Sonny, we're posting stuff that we're opposed to, and et cetera, et cetera. We've got an openly transgender person in the cabinet of our president now over health and human services, I'm told." And she said, I get it. We can post a lot of negative stuff about this, but what are we actually doing about it? And you know what I responded? I said, what you got to do is we have got to bring our kids home and rebuild an entirely new generation. We got to stop turning them over to the state for the majority of their waking hours, letting the state put these crazy ideas of transgenderism and all that kind of stuff into their brain. Bring them home, and we need to do what we are commanded to do in Deuteronomy chapter 6, and that is when the little Johnny and Susie wake up in the morning, we talking God. When we walk along the way, we're talking God. When we lay down at night, we're talking God. So that 24/7, they are inundated with God, not turned over to the world so that the world can teach them evolution and homosexuality and transgenderism and all this kind of garbage. We got to reestablish the family. The second thing then, as you might recall, was fellowship. Again, we took that from here, together all the time. Fellowship. And you might recall I took you to this idea of the rings, fellowship of the rings. And we rooted that again in another passage of scripture, letting the Bible teach us, not Sonny Child's head. And you might recall we got Nicodemus is showing up, and I told you that there were 3 layers of fellowship that were being talked about in this. Nicodemus is going to acknowledge that Jesus is from God. The same God that I worship, Nicodemus says, you worship. So acknowledge, so they're in that, they've got that level of commonality. Then the next level is, but do you acknowledge Jesus as the Christ? At this particular point, I don't believe Nicodemus was ready to do that. He might have been towards the end, but not at this particular point. So he's kind of straddling the fence right here between these 2 levels of fellowship. But the next level of fellowship is acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, 98.9% of the Christian population in the planet, it seems, believes that this is enough, that's enough to get you into the full fellowship with Jesus and his people. It ain't. We've got to move further. It's not enough to just acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God. According to the words of Christ, we've got to be born of the water and the Spirit. We got to move into the inner ring. And it's interesting that Peter, probably reflecting upon what he knew about Jesus and his teaching, Peter on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38, he's actually going to talk about this whole idea of being born of the water and the Spirit. He's going to say, repent, be baptized, that's water. Every one of you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins, and you receive the gift of the what? Holy Spirit. That's water and Spirit. And Peter, the inaugural sermon, first day of the church, Peter right out the gate, he's going to say that. If you want to have the most intimate fellowship, and by the way, I believe this is where you got to be saved. I also believe that this is where the remnant is. If you want that level, you got to be born of the water and the Spirit. And that's the ultimate levels of fellowship. Now, there is a level out here. We're going to talk about that as we deal with fellowship here in a moment. As we deal with friends here in a moment. But here are the 3 building blocks again. Now, as we go to friends, again, there are 3 levels of fellowship. Notice this circle out here. Many of our friends are out beyond the levels of fellowship that we can talk about with regards to acknowledging a true God, a religious system that we agree upon. We have a level of fellowship with them. Maybe they're, it's somebody that you work with at work and they don't believe in God or whatever, but they, whatever. Maybe it's a Muslim that believes in a different God than we do. They believe in Allah. We believe in Jehovah, whatever. But they're friends out here that you certainly don't have, or at least you shouldn't have the same level of intimate fellowship with them that you have with this level, and you don't have the same level of intimate fellowship with them as you have with this level, or this. You see, it's not, the closer you get here, these are the folks that are really where you want to be. But there are friends out here that we have, acquaintances that we have. I described them in our lesson as being self-sufficiently cynical. How do you reach them? You need to expose them to the presence of God, according to Romans chapter 1. They're self-sufficiently cynical because some of them are mad at God. And because they're mad at God, they turn him off. They claim to not believe in him, or at least they're not going to follow his values because he didn't do something for me or whatever it may be. And so they're mad at him. Others of them literally just believe that they don't need to have a God. They can be a God to themselves, so humanism, whatever it may be. But really and truly in the heart of hearts of all people, Romans chapter 1, we know that there is a creator. There's someone out there bigger than us, because every spring we look out the window and we see buds on the trees and we recognize the butterfly, and something had to do that. Someone had to do that. And the Big Bang Theory just doesn't cut it. And so the first level of friendship out here is these folks who don't even acknowledge the one true God. How do we reach them? Well, we got to get them into the presence of God by exposing the fact that they're already in the presence of God just by looking at nature. Then you got this second level, folks who do acknowledge the one true God, but they're not where they need to be. So how do we get them? These folks are dependent, but they're only dependent in an emergency. Well, you need to expose them to the fragility of life and the futility of human wisdom. This pandemic that we are presently trying to get our way through, and the vaccines, and everybody's celebrating the vaccines, even though some folks are actually dying after getting the vaccine. It exposes, does it not, how much faith we put into the human mind and the human medical system. It's almost become a god unto itself. We got to be really careful there. If you want to lead folks who are in this outer ring into the inner ring, you need to begin by exposing the fragility of life. And by the way, Christians are going around celebrating all of the humanism of the present vaccines and all that's going with that. You're not helping. You're just not helping. And then number 3, those who acknowledge Jesus as Christ, but they're not willing to acknowledge the need to be born of the water. Most of them will acknowledge the need to be born of the Spirit, but not this idea of water, which they're refusing the Bible, which is essentially what I say here. They ignore Matthew chapter 7. Remember Matthew 7, 21 and 23 through 23? That's the one that talks about, but Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and your name cast out demons, etc.? And God says, depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness. The way you reach these folks, and by the way, the majority of folks who call themselves Christians are these folks, and get them to be born of the water and the Spirit, is you've got to help them recognize it is possible to come to the conclusion that you're saved and yet not be saved. That's what Matthew chapter 7 says. And it's going to be a big part, by the way, of one of the classes we have here at SBS in the next quarter with regards to blessed assurance. There's a lot of folks out there who believe they're operating in the realm of assurance. I know I'm going to heaven, but they only know it from their own mind, their own heart, not from the heart of God. And we've got to be very, very careful. In order to bring these folks into the inner ring, we've got to expose them to the essentiality of scriptural authority. We got to go back and let the Bible speak about what the Bible speaks about. So, by way of review, then, that's what we've had over the last 12 weeks. And I hope that it's been a blessing to you. It certainly has been a blessing to me as I have studied it out and presented it. There are the questions again. May again plead with you to continue to remember us in your prayers and add us to your missions giving. We continue to try to expand and put things out, and expenses can be high with regards to online storage and programs we have to buy and stuff of that nature. But your support keeps us going. Here again are the classes that are going to begin next Sunday. And so actually, let's see, that'll be Sunday, that's Sunday, then this is next Monday, and etc. Okay, but those are the classes that you can watch live, and love for you to sign up to be a part of the School of Biblical Studies, which means that my wife will send you an email every Friday in which you will have the links to those live broadcasts, so you can go back and review them, or if you need to, watch them initially. And then you also have links to the question forms. And let me just say that the question forms are going to be different than the next quarter, a lot easier, self-grading. I think you're going to like it. Not self-degrading, unless you do really bad on the test, I guess. But it's self-grading. You're going to like it, I think. There we go. Page 62 in the old blue book. Hear the sweet voice of Jesus say, come unto me, I am the way. Hearken the loving call, obey. Come, for he loves you so. I can't tell you the number of times I preached a revival or whatever, and this has been the invitation song. Open for you the pearly gates, loved ones for you now watch and wait. Terrible thought to cry too late. Jesus, I come to thee. Only a step. Only a step. Come, for he bled for you and died. He's the same loving Savior yet. Jesus the crucified. What's holding you back? Have you met Jesus in the water? Have you died to yourself, been buried with him in baptism, rising to walk in the newness of life that God himself gives you? New life doesn't come until after you meet Jesus in the water. Have you done it? It's only a step. Let's get after it. Well, there you go. Wasn't sure my throat was going to make it, but I think we did. Lord's Supper fellowship. Here in just a few minutes, I'm going to go in and have that intimate moment with my family. And I pray that on this very special day that you'll take time to remember the Lord as well. I appreciate you, and thank you so much for being a part of this time that we share each week. And I pray that you'll put me on your schedule for the other live things that we do throughout the week. This is Sonny Child saying, be there. Matthew 16:26.